who joined the session today and who will be joining inshallah shortly. Thank you, Taif, and the team behind for organizing such a good webinar to have a last minute glimpse of the whole syllabus that are going to be covered for the upcoming exam, inshallah. So before I dig further into my slides, let me give an overview of what we are going to cover in this slide. But before that, let me introduce myself. Maybe we got introduced to many of you earlier. Maybe some of you, this is the first time we are meeting. So I will just try to keep, by the way, it looks like the virtual background that I'm using, it's cutting off my beard. So bear with me. Let me just, yeah, I think that's better. All right. So myself, Yusuf Sultan, I have developed together with Taif the SIPA preparation materials for SS and SG. I think a few modules is still left for SG, but most of the other modules, especially for the SS, are well developed. So my qualification is I'm from completely Sharia background, a graduate from Jamia Sharia Malibag in Dhaka, with Alimiya course as well as IFTA. Also, I had the opportunity to teach in Darul Ifta for 5 years, alhamdulillah. And then I pursued Masters in Islamic Finance, MSc in Islamic Finance from INSEF, Malaysia. Currently also pursuing my PhD at the same institution. And besides, I'm also heading Sharia and Governance of Ethis Group, one of the pioneer Islamic crowdfunding operators globally. And I'm also a master trainer recognized with IOFI as well as Sharia advisor registered with Securities Commission of Malaysia. So the reason behind sharing this background so that you have certain level of confidence who you are learning these materials with. I hope I tried to make the materials as accessible as I could. But definitely there has been shortcomings, and I pray to Allah and also seek prayers from you so that we can collectively overcome the shortcomings and have best exams for the upcoming exam, inshallah. All right, now for today's session, which is basically a preparatory session for the upcoming exam. I hope by this time, all of you or whoever is taking the exam have already gone through the entire SIPA book. And I believe that some of you may have not registered yet for the upcoming exam in June. However, you might be interested to participate in the exam in the maybe in near future. So to cover both parties, both groups of candidates or potential candidates, we'll try to make the slides as brief as we can and maybe further answer your questions when you have, inshallah, um, at the Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, let me share my screen. All right, I think the full screen is shared. Okay, so Brother Zia, can you confirm, are you seeing the full screen or partial screen? Which one?
It is full screen. It's correct.
All right. Okay, Jazakallah. Okay. All right. So a brief overview of what you have in SIPA, right? So you have 4 papers in SIPA. The first one is FAR or Financial Accounting and Reporting. The second one, AAE, Audit Assurance and Ethics. The third one, BRE, Business and Regulatory Environment. And the fourth one is SSNSG, which covers 2 different things together, Sharia standards and Sharia governance. Now, earlier, before these 4 papers were developed, the SIPA examination was a bit different, right? There was no such 4 papers, rather there was only standards. They would have particular Sharia standards as well as the governance and audit standards or financial reporting standards. However, FAS, financial accounting standards. And for CSA examinees, we had Sharia standards, which is still there, but CSA is also about to be revamped. The work is in progress, and we expect very soon, inshallah, CSA also would be split into two papers, which is Sharia Auditor and then Sharia Advisor, and which will also have further segmentation between which standards will be covered. Now, when we look into further in the SS and SG module, there is total 12 modules, out of which 7 is from SS or Sharia standards, and the 5 is from Sharia governance. Okay, so what we will try today is give a bit of, glimpse of what we have in those modules, so that it refreshes the memory, as well as if there is any question you can ask. So we can try helping you out so that you can better prepare for the examination. Okay, so from the SS part, SS and SG part, the first chapter, which is Sharia Fundamentals of Islamic Finance, it has a weightage of 9%. So it's a very good weightage basically, and it demands so, because in this chapter we have the key concepts of Islamic financial system, including the key characteristics like riba, gharar, and other prohibitions, as well as a brief definition and a structure of Islamic law of contracts. So if you have already gone through our preparation modules, I will just give a few recap. So in the chapter, we will see, for example, in gharar, right? In the definitions of gharar and how gharar could happen. So we saw that the gharar could happen in the form of contract. So for example, there is a prohibition in Sharia to embody two sales in one sale agreement, and making one contract contingent to a future event, an event that is uncertain. So in Sharia, there shouldn't be any ambiguity. Gharar denotes ambiguity which is material, which is excessive, which may be considered as something that is influencing the customer to make the choice, and which is basically a material ambiguity, excessive ambiguity. So this is what gharar is. Now, if we look at few others, for example, this one, the contract effective on a future event. Okay, we already covered forward and futures, where both counter values are deferred. So this happens in the commodities exchange, in the currency transactions for foreign currency exchanges. So there are contracts like forwards, futures, and one main ground of their prohibitions is the gharar, because both counter values are differed. For example, in a forward contract, both are differed. The price is differed, the commodity is differed, and Sharia has a specific, ruling that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam naha an bai'il kali bil kali. He prohibited deferred for deferred transactions. So similarly, options, it doesn't have basically any value in itself. It's the basis of it is based on gharar. Hence, wise in IOFI Sharia standards, it is considered as prohibited. So these are in the form of the contract, and you may find these things across the discussions of murabaha, across the discussions of salam and istisna. So the fundamental prohibitions will stay the same, but the applications may be in the different contracts. Similarly, when it comes to the subject matter, if the subject matter is not existent except for salam and istisna, which has different set of rulings, set of rules, or it is not owned, it is not possessed. For example, in case of short selling, right, it is not possessed, either actual possession or constructive possession. Actual possession is to take the delivery physically. Constructive possession is where you take the delivery of the ownership papers and also take the risks. The risks are properly transferred to you. So if those are not there, or maybe the quantity and quality is not specified, so these all lead to gharar. In some cases, those gharar will lead to a fasad in the contract, which can be rectified if the gharar is removed. In some cases, it may also void the contract. So these were, if you read the materials further, you inshallah can get into. Similarly, when it comes to the subject matter, so if it's a debt or receivable, there is a gharar, because a debt or receivable is something that you cannot, possess without further, conditional elements. So this imposes gharar on the subject matter, which is why it is Sharia-wise objectionable. And there are conditions. For example, there is a a separate Sharia standard also issued, which is yet to be translated in English. Still, it's available in Arabic. Similarly, sale of expected future cash flow. There is also gharar. For example, this happens in the startup companies. They don't have assets in the present. Rather, they have assets, expected cash flow in the future, and that's what being sold. So there is a gharar, and that needs to be minimized. Similarly, sale of property which is illegally possessed, stolen goods. So all those makes it the sale contract questionable. And finally, the terms of the contract, if the price is not specified, the payment period is not specified, will it be paid on the spot? Usually the default state is that the price would be paid and on spot, meaning that there is no defer payment arrangement unless it is properly mentioned. So those are the things that can constitute gharar, and those can make the contract impermissible or void, or something fasid. Fasid means it has to be rectified. So as we can see, we today in our slides, we will try to restrict into the impermissible elements or prohibited elements or questionable things from Sharia point of view, so that if you understand and acknowledge those things, inshallah, you will be able to understand most questions, hopefully. Then there are a few basics of Islamic law of contracts, which were also addressed. And I think when we discussed in the previous slide, this part has already been addressed. But to recap, the subject matter is required to be existing, except for salam and istisna, by the way. It has to be legitimate in Sharia. It has to be owned by the seller. It has to be possessed by the seller. And finally, it has to be ascertained, specified in the contract. Now, a few other things also has been discussed, as this chapter is about fundamentals or principles of Islamic finance. It really contains a lot of materials, and you can see 9% weightage is attached to it. So it's really recommended if someone is, this is the first time you are studying Islamic finance, to at least go through the basic principles and definitions. Now, it also included promises. In Sharia, promises needs to be unilateral. If a promise is bilateral, meaning that both parties agree to each other's promise, then it almost constitutes a contract. So then we need to look at what is the promise about, and in most cases it could be, a Sharia violation as well. And so there are a few other things as well related with this. I'm not recapping it. I think these are the 3 slides we had today for the first chapter. And here is a quick question. You can see if you can answer this question. Brother Hassan, are we going to pop up any quiz in the for the audience on this one? Okay, here it is. So just go through the question and answer it. So Miss Khadija is a school teacher. She announced in her grade 5 class that the highest achiever of the exam will get a reward. In this case, one of the contracting parties is unknown and the subject matter is also not determined. What is the Sharia status of this contract? Right. So just think about it and try to get an answer of it. We'll just give you a couple of minutes maybe. All right, thank you for your answers. Basically, the answer is B. So those you have responded to it, thank you so much. The answer is B. Why? Because in a non-commutative contract, one party can donate anything in his ownership to another party with no consideration or free of cost. The donor transfers ownership of the things to the donee, meaning the one who is basically on the recipient end, free of any obligation or commitment. So I hope that really engaged you. Inshallah, we will have another question very soon in the end of the next chapter. Okay, now let's go to the next chapter. As you can see, the weightage of this chapter is 15%, which is even more than the previous chapter. And it really makes sense because if you look at the list, Murabaha, which is more or less one of the top in many countries, the top most used Islamic finance instrument. If you look at Tawarruq, in many other countries, this is the top instrument that is being used. Then Salam and Istisna are also parallelly used. So basically, those sale agreements or trade-based contracts are highly popular when it comes to Islamic financial institutions. So that's why it demands that the weightage to be given is also quite high. Now let's look into a few of the glimpses of it. So again, since there's a sale agreements, and remember in the first chapter when where it discusses the fundamentals of Islamic contracts or Islamic law of contract. Now, the contract that whenever in the classical fiqh books, whenever the fundamentals of Islamic law of contract are basically described, they always take first the sale contracts or trade contracts, because those are the very primary objective of any commutative contract. For example, if we are going to do a partnership, of course, that partnership would have to do some trade to make profit, some business to make profits. So either there will be a trade or there will be an ijara or lease. And again, ijara is also part of sale or bay'. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that the things that you have learned in the first chapter, at least on the conditions, it will be same. So you can see here, for example, for murabaha, the subject matter, the conditions will be pretty much same. But one more condition here is that it cannot be gold, silver, or currency. Why is it that? Because if the subject matter is gold, silver, or currency, and as we know that the murabaha in practice is also combined with a deferred payment arrangement, meaning that the price will be paid later on at installment. So when the murabaha is on gold and silver, it has to be, it has to also comply with the currency exchange requirements. So hence, the subject matter, if it is gold, silver, and currency, it doesn't meet with those principles, and it will be problematic. Now, when it comes to price, what are the price that we can add into murabaha? So we can see, we can only add direct cost, meaning that any cost that are actually realized by the seller, that is what they can incorporate in murabaha. But why is it that? Is it because we cannot charge more than the cost, or what? No, it's not. Basically, murabaha is one of the buyu'ul amana, one of the trust-based sales. So a sale can be without mentioning the purchase price. A sale can be with mentioning the purchase price. Now, there are few types of sales when you are supposed to, or you are expected to disclose the purchase price or the cost price. So one is murabaha, when you disclose the price, and basically the price you are selling at is a premium, is at a premium, is at a profit. There is another type of contract where you are also disclosing the purchase price, but you are selling at a loss. That is called wadi'ah. Then there is another type of contract where you disclose the price, but you don't make profit, you don't make loss either. So it's at par value you are selling. That's called tawliya. Now, this type of contracts are basically introduced to ensure some level of trust. So sometimes there are people who cannot recognize if he is making profit or loss, so that the seller can disclose, see, this is what I have purchased at, and this is what I'm selling to you. Now, when Islamic finance, modern Islamic finance started, and the scholars were helping the practitioners to come with alternatives to riba-based things. So they basically suggested firstly sales contracts, because that's what gives a solution to many alternative on many riba-based transactions. And when it comes to a sale transaction, since the transaction will be with a Islamic financial institution, they suggested that this would be a better approach, so that the cost and price is properly disclosed. So that's where murabaha comes into the picture. So since it's a murabaha, hence it has to be disclosed. It has to disclose the cost price. Now the question comes, what would be considered as the cost price? So this is what we have in the slide. It's only the direct cost. It's not any additional cost. Okay. And if he receives a discount, it has to be incorporated as well. It has to be known to the other party. And if there is a rebate provided, which is unconditional, then it's acceptable, meaning that, let's say the Islamic financial institution says that if you pay early, then we'll give you a rebate, then that is problematic. But if the customer pays early and without prior arrangement, the bank or financial institution gives a rebate, that should be fine. Okay, now there are a few types of securities which are also discussed in the in the chapter. I think I will just skip it. Then some additional conditions for tawarruk. Now tawarruk is basically one step more to murabaha. So in murabaha, what happens? The financial institution acquires the asset from a vendor, then sells it to the basically the customer. Now in tawarruk, the customer is then have one step further, so he will not be purchasing the asset per se, rather he wants to take the cash, so he will sell it to another vendor to obtain the cash. That's what tawarruk is. Now there are few additional conditions in tawarruk. So there are several sales we can see, from vendor or commodity seller 1 to bank or financial institution, from financial institution to the customer, from the customer to the commodity seller 2. So several sales agreements we can see. So all those sales agreements should constitute, possession of the commodities. Now either it can be actual or physical or constructive. That's a different thing. And we have to bear in mind that the seller 1 should not be sold the asset at the later again. So meaning that the first seller shouldn't be the last buyer as well. Why is it that? Because that would constitute buyback. If I'm purchasing from you and then selling back to you, and it is pre-agreed, or that's what the customary practice has been made, that's what buyback is, or bay'ul aina, which is considered haram or prohibited to majority of the Sharia scholars. And since it has multiple agreements, and this is true for all contract that has multiple agreements, the agreements need to be separate, and customer should sell the commodity himself or through an agent other than the IFI, because whenever we are engaging IFI, it becomes an organized tawarruk, and that is also something that has been criticized by Sharia scholars. So we have to be cautious that whatever contracts that we use in Islamic finance, those needs to be used genuinely with the conditions of such contracts properly upheld. So that's what we are trying to emphasize. I have another slide on difference between salam and istisna, but I guess I will not be going to it. Just to recap, salam is basically a contract where one party sells some commodity or something that is readily available in the market to other party, whereby the commodity or the mabi', I mean the thing that has been sold, that's what deferred. The price is paid on spot, but the commodity is deferred. That's what salam is. For istisna, it's similar, that the commodity is deferred, meaning it's basically used to manufacture something or construct something. For example, a bridge, road, or maybe some machineries, all those can be structured through istisna. However, the price can be paid 100% upfront. It can be 100% deferred, or there could be agreed upon milestone-based payments, progress payments, whereby the payments will be made at certain progress. So that was salam istisna is. Other than that, I think the differences are should be quite clear. So I will skip it. Let's go to the next quiz, next poll, please. So the question here is, under what circumstances in murabaha can various profit rates as a benchmark be charged? That's the question. So the options you have is when murabaha transaction is bifurcated into tranches, number 2 in deferred murabaha, number 3 in C in spot murabaha, and number D is none of the above. So to make the question further clear, is there any circumstance where the rate of the murabaha, so murabaha is what? Is a sale contract. So can we say, okay, the price is basically benchmarked to something, or it has to be fixed? That's what basically the question is. Okay, no one is choosing D. All right, never mind. Thank you for trying. I will end the poll. So basically, the correct answer is D. Why is it? Because the profit in the murabaha transaction cannot be benchmarked to some, some benchmark. It has to be specified. When we are determining the price, we can take a benchmark to determine the price. However, it has to be specified and it cannot be just kept hanging. So hope that helps you, inshallah. Okay, now the next chapter, which is basically equity-based contracts, and we can see a 7% weightage has been assigned. It is about musharaka, mudaraba, and diminishing musharaka. Now, few things that we have to remind ourselves is that what is, okay, firstly about the concepts. Now, what is musharaka? Musharaka is a partnership agreement between two or more parties where every party will basically give some sort of capital and they will share in the profit and loss. Now, when it comes to sharing the profit, there will be a pre-agreed profit sharing ratio, and few of the fundamental conditions of the profit we have in this slide. Basically, a sleeping partner cannot have a profit sharing ratio more than the capital contribution ratio. So for example, there are two partners, they contributed 50,000 each, and together, so it's 100,000, right? Now, when it comes to profit sharing ratio, they're saying, okay, partner A will take 40%, partner B will take 60%. Now, in order to ensure that the 60% profit is halal or proper for partner B, we have to see if partner B is a sleeping partner or a working partner. Meaning that if there was any such condition that partner B will not work whatsoever, he will just be as a sleeping partner, then he will not be entitled to the additional 10% profit, because profit can only be entitled to the capital to work or to the risk that someone takes. Now, in this case, he is contributing 50% capital, that's it. He is not doing anything else. So we cannot give him profit more than that. However, when it comes to loss, loss is always borne proportionate to the capital contribution ratio. So loss is something that you cannot agree. Okay, even though you put 50,000, you will be bearing 10%, and I will bear the less 20%. No, even if they mutually agree, still it's not valid. So that's the very basic understanding of profit and loss. And one more thing is that a ground rule in profit and loss profit is that no such mechanism can be adopted where one party is deprived from the profit entirely in any scenario. So let's say we develop a mechanism. Okay, what is the mechanism? That if the profit reaches $40,000, then both party will share. If it is below $40,000, then only partner A will take. Is it valid? No. Why? Because if the profit is below 40,000, then only one party is getting the share of the profit. The other partner is completely deprived of it. That's what will be a zulm. It will not be proper for the contract. So we cannot do that. Okay, now another scenario. we are saying profit, sharing in the profit. Now, what is profit? Profit is after you deduct all the expenses from the revenue. Now, if let's say we say, okay, we will share revenues instead of profit, meaning that whenever we have revenue, let's say from sales or whatever, so we will share directly it. So both parties, so we will basically what we are saying is that let's say there is $100,000 revenue, right? So before taking out expenses, let's say expenses is $80,000. So before taking the expenses, we are saying that one party will get 50% of the revenue. Now, what happens when we give the 50% to that party? So once we give 50,000 to him, we are left with 50,000 to give to the other partner. Now the expense itself is 80,000, meaning that the other partner basically cannot get the share in the profit because he has to pay the expenses as well. Now this is what we call depriving the other partner entirely from profit, which is not valid. Hence, profit can be, the sharing ratio can only be from profit, not from revenue or anything else. And it cannot have any such mechanism which in any scenario deprives the other partners from profit entirely. So those are the ground rules. And if we follow that, I think any different types of mechanism we can adopt. We have elaborated this during our lecture as well. So I will just skip it. And in terms of diminishing musharaka, there are few Sharia principles. Basically, since it's a musharaka first, it will have general rules of musharaka, right? But other than general musharaka, there are a few other components. There is a rent component, there is a sale and purchase agreement as well. So how diminishing musharaka works is that, let's say someone wants to purchase a land or maybe purchase a house. Usually for house it is used. So what the customer would do, customer would, let's say, put in 10% and bank would put 90%. So there is a musharaka formed or joint ownership formed. Now after this joint ownership is formed, every month the customer would pay a portion to increase his ownership ratio. On the other hand, since he is using the 90% of the bank, he has to pay a portion of rent as well. So this is where the monthly installment is comprising of two components. One is ownership price. Also, second one is the rent. Right. So this will happen for a few years or few periods, and at the end there will be a simple sell and purchase agreement, or in some cases even hiba to the other partner, so that the customer becomes the complete owner. Now, in order to make this happen, there are few things. Number one is a musharaka, so it has to abide by the musharaka rules. Number two, there is a rent component, and in a rental agreement, basically there are responsibilities taken care of by the lessor and also the lessee. For example, the one who takes the lease, who is lessee, he is responsible for day-to-day periodic maintenance. However, if the thing itself gets damaged completely, or the fundamental utility is no longer achievable, then it is the responsibility of the owner of the asset to fix it, right? Until he fixes it, he cannot take the rent. It is not halal for him. So this is where the rental part comes in. Then there is a sale and purchase. So for sale and purchase, maybe there will be also a wa'ad, a promise to purchase by the bank, by the customer, and further there could be a sale and purchase agreement. All in all, there is a sequence, right? So the whole sequence needs to be maintained, and it is true also for murabaha. So wherever we have multiple different agreements coming into the picture, we have to strictly follow the sequence. For example, in murabaha, if the customer is signing the murabaha agreement before the bank even purchases it, then the agreement is not valid, right? If the customer is already having the asset which he is taking as a murabaha from the bank, then also murabaha is not valid. So those sequence needs to be maintained properly. I think I will skip further. Then furthermore, guidelines on profit of mudaraba again is the same. Only difference in mudaraba from musharaka is that in mudaraba, not all part, it's only two party, and one party will give the capital, and mudarib or the managing partner will basically manage it. The profit will be shared across them as a profit sharing profit sharing ratio. Loss will be entirely borne by the capital provider, because as I mentioned previously as well, loss is always borne according to the proportion of capital ratio. Now, since in Mudaraba, the Rabbul Mal or the capital provider gives the whole capital, he needs to bear the whole loss unless there is a negligence or breach of contract by the Mudarib. In that case, he has to cover the loss, not the loss of the capital, which is actual loss, not the profit in any case. So those are the fundamental things. I think next just we will go to the small question for you, and you will have the options popping up in your screen. The question is, a binding promise by a partner to acquire another partner's equity share is not allowed if it is according to the face value of the equity share, the market value of the equity share, the agreement of the two parties, and none of the above. When you are answering in your actual exam, the questions will be MCQ like this, and you always have to be very careful of the whole question. Sometimes it will be tricky, sometimes it will be very simple, but the way the question is put, it will make things tricky. So we'll just allow a few more seconds, inshallah. Okay, basically when a partner gives a binding promise that he will acquire another partner's shares, in other words, he will purchase another partner's shares, he cannot agree on the face value. Why? Because when he is agreeing on a face value, he is basically guaranteeing the capital of the other partner, which is not allowed. If he is giving a promise, binding promise that okay, I will purchase your equity or share at the market value or at a value to be agreed on between us on the date of, I mean, when we are going to actually purchase, then in both cases he is not guaranteeing the capital, because the market value, let's say the face value of the share is $100,000 now, but maybe when he is purchasing, the market value is 80,000. So with this promise, he is not guaranteeing 100,000. Also, if it is left out to the agreement on agreement agreed upon price during that time, this also doesn't give a guarantee, because the agreed upon price may be 120,000 or it could be even only 20,000. So only the first part is not allowed. So when I said that please be careful when you're reading the question, you see it is saying that not allowed. So sometimes the whole question, when you read the first time, it could be very easy to understand, but if you look at the keywords, that's where it makes the difference. Okay, now let's go very quickly to the next chapter, which is basically Ijara and Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik, which is all about lease agreements and also diminishing Ijara. So diminishing Ijara and diminishing Musharaka has very common properties. So since we already discussed diminishing Musharaka, I think we'll not explain much on that now. So some rulings on Ijara is, for example, I already mentioned previously some of it. So for example, in terms of expenses, the day-to-day maintenance is on the lessee. The ownership risks and costs are on the lessor, the one who is basically giving the rental. In terms of guarantees, yes, they are allowed to obtain security for debt payment. This is not only here for any other contracts. Whenever there is a debt, the creditor, the one who is basically on the recipient end of the debt, he is allowed to take collaterals or any other types of security from the debtor. But of course, the collateral or the security has to be liquidated according to the Sharia regulations. So that's something different. That's we have to always keep in mind. Okay. Guarantees, yes. Okay, we already discussed to compensate for losses resulting from. Okay, yeah. This one I think we already know from Musharaka as well. So it's the same. Ijara is terminated when the asset is sold to lessee, when it is sold to third parties. So, for example, in Ijara Muntahiya with Tamlik or Musharaka Mutanaqisa, mean diminishing Musharaka or diminishing Ijara, in both cases, the asset is sold to basically the lessee at some point, the customer. So, if that is there, then Ijara will be terminated upon that. Or if that asset is totally distracted. So, this is what I mentioned. I can recall a recent Sukuk case which I was looking into, and the Sukuk is basically structured based on Ijara, right? It's a Sukuk Ijara. Now the problem is the assets are yet to be developed, and the assets have basically low lifespan. So meaning that the asset has a high possibility to get destructed or damaged before the Sukuk tenure ends. Now we raised a question basically in that sukuk, that how that entire inventory of the asset Ijara assets will be maintained, because if the asset is totally destructed and no longer the utility is no longer there, then that Ijara is terminated for that particular asset, and the rental, if it is still received, will not be halal for the lessor. So this is very, very important. We have to understand that if asset is totally destructed, then Ijara is not valid. If the asset is partially destructed, then the lessee will have the option to terminate. If he is still going through that, then he will of course have to pay lesser based on mutual agreement with the lessor. Okay. Then in case of Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik, now what is Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik? Muntahiya means finishes, bit Tamlik with transfer of ownership. Now Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik is lease contract in the beginning, but it ends with transfer of ownership. So let's say maybe an airplane company, right? Airlines. So they are purchasing. They are basically they want to acquire some airplanes, and they started with leasing it from the manufacturer, and at some point they will become the ultimate ownership, right? So that's how what we call Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik. Now the transfer at the very end could be by a promise to sell, or I mean, in case it's a promise to sell, then there will be a sale agreement at the end, or there could be a promise to gift. So let's say the Ijara tenure is 10 years. After that, the lessor will just transfer the ownership by a gift, Heba contract. Or it could be like a diminishing Musharaka that we already discussed. So those are all three possibilities are there. I think with that we end this chapter as well, and there is another question for you to check. The question is, in a car ijara, which of the following is the responsibility of the lessee? Takaful coverage, service and oil change on completion of certain mileage, registration and annual tax, usual wear and tear. Usual wear and tear meaning that, so if, for example, you have to maybe change the tire which has a certain lifespan, so those are the responsibilities of the lessee. So is it true? Which ones? You just have to answer that. So I think this one you need to read the questions properly. So I will give you a few more seconds, inshallah. Okay, mashallah, 13 answers so far. Yeah, please participate. I mean, even if you're not confident, just answer. I think that will really help your brain to, grasp the concept quite strongly instead of just listening. So just go ahead, and whatever you think is the right option, just go and answer. Okay, maybe 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's end the poll. The answer is basically D. Why is it that? Because if we look at what is the answer in D, sorry. So the D is 2 and 4. What is number 2? Number 2 is service and oil change on completion of certain mileage, which is basically periodic maintenance, as I mentioned. And number 4 is the same as well. But if you look at number 1, which is takaful coverage, this usually is not part of periodic maintenance. Rather, this belongs to the owner. This is under the ownership risk. Similarly, registration and annual tax as well. So those are not on the lessee. If someone is transferring those to lessee, then lessee has to recover them or reimburse them from the owner. Okay, thank you for participating in the poll. Next chapter is about sukuk. It has 7% weightage. Now, what is sukuk? Sukuk is basically certificates. I think the analogy to shares would be much more easy to understand. Now, what is shares? If I ask, what is shares? Shares is basically certificates. Certificates of what? Certificates of ownership. Ownership of what? Ownership of the company, right? And then what the company has? Company has some assets, some cash, some this and that. So similarly, sukuk is also certificates of ownership. Now, ownership of what? Ownership of, again, it would be like a company, because an SPV or a special company or a special purpose vehicle would be established. But then what the company would hold? The company would hold assets, tangible assets, intangible assets, usufructs and services. So the question would be, then what is the difference between sukuk and shares? Why do we need sukuk and why not shares? So the answer to this is basically the origin of the instrument. The origin of such instrument was to bring an alternative to bonds. So we know the characteristic of bonds is that it gives a fixed yield, annual premium, annual yield, and hence it has some acceptability in the conventional market. Now, just to give a replica of that, from Islamic finance point of view, sukuk was introduced. But let me give you a caution. Sukuk is something that is still not so favorable instrument among the Sharia scholars. Why? Because it has been structured in such a manner it gives guaranteed return, guaranteed yield, and so on and so forth. But still, for the growth of the industry, there has been parameters put into it, which we can find in IOFI Sharia standard. You can see here in the SIPA book, and hence we have to go through the certain conditions that they have IOFI has mentioned. Okay, so in this slide there are some differences between conventional bond and sukuk. In conventional bond, it's just merely a loan with interest. Investment sukuk will have some contracts, like it could be a sale contract, it could be a lease or partnership contract. So it could be a murabaha sukuk, salam sukuk, istisna sukuk, ijara sukuk, or even a musharaka or mudaraba sukuk. One of the most popular sukuk is the ijara structure, which is also very much favorable to Sharia scholars. What happens in a ijara sukuk? In a very outset, I don't have the structure here in my slides, but just to remind you, I hope you already gone through the materials. So how the sukuk happens? Let's say the government of country XYZ, they want to build an airport, right? So in order to build the airport, or let's say they have the airport, but they need money for something. So what they will do, they will basically issue sukuk for that. How it will work? They will establish a company which we call SPV, or special purpose vehicle, which will be bankruptcy remote. It will also serve the capacity of trustee on behalf of the sukuk holders. So sukuk holders are like owners of this company, or owners of the asset held by the company. Now that company, the asset that is specified, like in this case the airport, will be transferred. Now the transfer may not be fully, complete transfer of registration and everything, but there will be certificates, and there will be agreements done between the parties so that the sukuk holders have recourse to the asset. Now, once the asset is transferred to that SPV, who is the owner of the asset? The sukuk holders. Now, the airport will not be used by the sukuk holders definitely. So it will be leased back to the government. So that's where we call it ijara, because there is a component of lease. But it doesn't mean that from end to end, from beginning to end, it's only a lease contract. Of course, there will be musharaka partnership between the sukuk holders. There will be a trustee agreement. There will be a service and maintenance agreement. So there will be few other components and pieces and parcel in this sukuk arrangement. Anyway, so this sukuk will basically be structured based on lease, sale, partnership contracts. Now, in IOFI Sharia standard as well as in SIPA book, you will see there are some reservations when it comes to the salam or istisna sukuk, because in those sukuk the commodity will be transferred in future. So it's a deferred. I mean, the relation, the right that the sukuk holder has is a receivable. It's not an asset. Now, when it is a receivable, you cannot trade it at more or less than the par value, because that will make it riba. Hence, in salam and istisna, until the asset has been possessed by the sukuk holders and the SPV, it is not tradable. So there are such certain such conditions which we have discussed in our materials. In terms of connection to the real economy, the conventional bonds doesn't have any connection. Investment sukuk, of course, that's the beauty of sukuk. It will have basically connection to the real economy. Now, of course, there is a debate between asset-backed sukuk or asset-based sukuk. Now, as you know, in asset-backed sukuk, the investors have full recourse to the asset, while in asset-based, it is not the case. So if you look at the latest IOFI sukuk governance standard, we can see that they have basically favored asset-backed sukuk, because in asset-based sukuk, the investors do not have recourse to the asset, and it more or less replicates the conventional bond structure, which is not favorable by Sharia. Okay, in terms of tradability, it depends on the underlying structure. Can we guarantee that from by the issuer? No, in sukuk, we cannot have any guarantee. But again, as I mentioned, in sukuk, even though in the main agreement there is no guarantee, but there are additional supplemental agreements which almost provide the same guarantee that are expected. So this is what criticized by Sharia scholars as an issue. Now, use of proceed in conventional bonds, it is up to the bond issuer, like the government. They can use it wherever they want. They can use it for Sharia compliant or Sharia non-compliant avenues. But when it comes to sukuk, of course, the use has to be Sharia compliant. Okay, now let's go to the next quiz. Which of the following represents sukuk? Can you answer it? Is it shares in company's profit, or undivided shares in ownership of asset and usufruct, or shares in company's cash account, or shares in company's stock trade? Okay, thank you for your participation. Let's end the poll. The answer is B. It's basically an undivided shares in usufruct of assets and ownership of assets and usufruct. Why it is not A, shares in company's profit? Because in the sukuk may not always give you shares in the company's profit. It may be yield from the asset itself, and it's not shares in company's cash account as well. It's not shares in the company's stock in trade as well. So it's basically undivided shares in ownership of assets and usufruct. Okay, let's move to the next part, takaful. Takaful basically is an alternative to conventional insurance in the light of Sharia. Now, what is takaful? If you remember in our course materials, we have covered that in takaful, the participants basically participate as donors in based on tabarru, and then the operator basically maintains two different accounts, one for its own and the other for the policy holders. Operator basically plays a role of agent or role of mudarib when managing the funds. So they may either have a fixed percentage to manage, or they may share in the profit when they invest the fund. And the insurance account is entitled to its profits and is liable to also the losses. If there is a surplus, it goes back to the participants. And when the company is liquidated, then all provisions and accumulated reserves are basically spent on charitable purposes. That's it. And then Sharia supervisory board has to be there, and company should adhere to the Sharia Islamic principles, right? Now, why we cannot do conventional insurance? Basically, there are three elements. There is riba. Basically, conventional insurance is not donation. It is a sale and purchase agreement. Now, what are you purchasing? You are purchasing something that is contingent on something else, something that is conditional on something else. So that's where it makes it like a gharar, and also it makes it akin to gambling, and also riba. Those are the three basic reasons for which we cannot do basically conventional insurance. So with that, I think we'll move to the next chapter. Quick quiz again for you. If you have gone through the SIPA materials, who should bear the operating expenses? Should it be from the surplus of technical reserves, or should it be from the shareholders funds, or from the policy holders or participants funds, or it should be provided as a qad hasan by the participants funds? Who should be bearing the operating expenses of a takaful operator? All right, thank you so much for your participation. The answer is B. Uh, Basically, operating expenses of the operator has to be borne by the operator itself. Now, where does the operator has money from? They have money from the shareholders funds. Hence, it would be borne by the shareholders funds. All right, let's proceed to the next chapter, which is the last chapter of SS, common banking solution services and other solutions. So in this chapter, they covered corporate banking, retail banking, the instruments, and also the collateral, which is rahan or mortgage, then conversion of conventional bank to an Islamic bank, as well as sale of commodities in organized markets and rules of calculating profit. We will touch into a few things. Firstly, on guarantees. Uh, Personal guarantee in trust contract is strictly prohibited unless it is intended to cover misconduct. So, for example, what is the trust contract? Let's say mudaraba, musharaka, those are trust contracts. Agency contract, it's also a trust contract. So in all those cases, should we or can we take guarantees from the mudarib, from the managing partner of the musharaka? The answer is yes, only when it is supposed to be used in case of negligence or breach of contract or misconduct. Because only in those three cases, the mudarib or the managing partner will be liable for the loss. In other cases, let's say if he is making a profit less than the expected profit, or let's say if he has done all everything properly but he got less profit. For example, in this time of pandemic, right, because of COVID-19, profit went down. In fact, many incurred losses as well, but it was not due to a negligence, misconduct, or breach of contract from the mudarib or from the managing partner. Now, can we liquidate the promise? Can we take the personal, liquidate the personal guarantee, or let's say post dated check? No, because that's not what Sharia has allowed us to do. If the mudarib or musharaka managing partner has done their job, still incurs the loss, that's the loss that has to be borne by both parties based on their capital contribution ratio. Now, in case of a mudaraba, even though we think that the whole loss has to be borne by the capital provider, but it's not the case that mudarib is not bearing any loss. Mudarib's loss is the time that he has employed, the time and energy that he has put into this mudaraba venture. So if there is loss, then he is losing the time that he has provided, right? So I hope that is clear. Then on credit cards, okay, basically in credit and debit card, if it is incurring any riba, it's haram, it's prohibited. If it's not riba, but there are some privileges, right? Some discounts, some for example, you are getting a special lounge in the airport or somewhere else, those things are permissible. When it's a credit card, because the settlement takes time, in that case we have to be cautious. If the settlement is on spot, then we can use gold and silver through that. If the settlement is not on spot, meaning within T plus 2 days, transaction days and the next 2 days, then we cannot use those credit cards for purchasing gold, silver, and currency. The next part is about rahan or collaterals. There are few Sharia considerations we have to remember. A rahan asset or a collateral asset is a trust at the hand in the hands of the creditor. The creditor is taking this rahan just as a security that he will get his money back. That's it. He doesn't have any other right on the asset. So if there is an appreciation in the asset, uh, all those appreciation will be belonging to the actual owner of the asset, who is the debtor. Similarly, if a benefit needs to be taken from the asset, the permission needs to be sought from the debtor or the owner of the asset. In fact, if it is something that is rented out, then he has to pay rent, right? He cannot, and he has to pay market value or market rent, not something that is underpaid or undervalued, because then it could be, it may be categorized as a benefit in exchange of a loan. Now, what is the problem with that? The problem is there is a hadith, sorry, not hadith, kullu qardin jarra nafa'an fahuwa riba. This is a legal maxim as well. Hadith or not, I'm not sure at this moment, I forgot it. We'll have to check again. But it's a legal maxim, kullu qardin jarra nafa'an fahuwa riba. Every loan that brings along with it any benefit is considered riba. So we cannot take any tangible or intangible benefit against giving a loan. So if the creditor, the one who is giving the loan, he is utilizing the collateral asset, it's like you is basically taking the benefit. In my country, it's very widespread. Villagers, you collateralize their asset to get loans, and the asset is basically used by the creditor for an unlimited amount of time without any charge. And it is very widespread that they think that it is their right, which is completely not, and it is 100% riba, which we need to be aware of. So I think that's, with that we will go to the next chapter. Another quiz for you: stipulation of guarantee is strictly prohibited in which contract? In murabaha, in musharaka, in qard, in none of the above? Again, in which contract stipulating a guarantee is strictly prohibited? All right, thank you very much for participating. Let's end the poll. The answer is B. In Musharaka or Mudaraba contract, a stipulation of guarantee is strictly prohibited because that will make the contract immediately a riba contract. Okay, so with that, we are finishing SS, which is basically Sharia standards. Now, the next few things are related to governance. The first module is about corporate and Sharia governance. In this chapter, basically, they elaborated on what is corporate governance all about, what are the components, what are the governance principles and mechanisms, and a bit of Sharia governance. So you can see why we need, I mean, what are the IOFI governance principles for Islamic financial institutions. So there are a few principles IOFI has always emphasized on, which is to have effective Sharia compliance structures, fair treatment of all equity holders and stakeholders, fund providers, right? Fit and proper conditions of the board and management, having effective oversight, audit and governance committee, then risk management, avoidance of conflict of interest, appropriate compensation policy oversight, public disclosure, code of conducts and ethics, and finally appropriate enforcement of governance principles and standards. So these are basically the governance principles. Other than those, I don't have much slide on it. I think, yeah, this one maybe Sharia governance framework. So you can see in this chapter, they also introduced the primary Sharia governance framework, which are further elaborated in the next chapters. So in the Sharia governance framework, there are basically 4 components. The Sharia supervisory board. So there will be a board, of course, underneath the board of directors or at par of the board of directors, and they will have certain responsibility or oversight of Sharia, and then there will be internal Sharia audit and external Sharia audit, and also internal Sharia compliance. So IOFI, I mean, in the SIPA book, in the next chapters, we will see that they will basically elaborate those parts and components further. So another quiz for you to just see if you are on the right track. So in this question, we'll see what are the elements of Sharia governance: internal Sharia compliance, independent external Sharia audit, senior management, Sharia supervisory board, regulatory bodies, and internal Sharia compliance. So put your best guess and try to answer. Thank you. There is no D, by the way. There is a D in the poll, but there is no D in the question. Yeah, dear attendees, this was the last slide before this question. So it should be very easy, but I see many are making wrong. All right, we'll end the poll. The answer to this question is B. So let's see what is there in the B. So it says all except 3 and 5. Now 3 is senior management and 5 is internal Sharia, sorry, regulatory bodies. Now, regulatory bodies are not part of Sharia governance framework, and also senior management is also not an element of Sharia governance. You can look into it again. So the elements of Sharia governance is Sharia supervisory board, internal Sharia audit, internal Sharia compliance, and external Sharia audit. Okay, really thankful to all of you. You are really putting a lot of focus and contributing, participating in the questions. Next chapter is about Sharia Supervisory Board, the second chapter of SG, which is basically the first component of Sharia governance.
Can you hold on for a second? I think If
Sure,
somebody wants to ask a question, Fardil
sure.
Bugalo, I think. Okay, you can.
He can unmute himself. He can talk. Brother Fardil, you want to ask some question? You can unmute yourself.
Can you hear us,
Brother
Fardil?
Fardil Baghol, you can ask a question. You raise hand, we see. You can unmute yourself and you can ask the question if you want.
Yeah, maybe the brother is not on the desk, most probably.
Yeah, I think by mistake maybe. Okay. Okay, please continue. No problem. Any
All right. Okay. Anytime if you have any, if you have any questions, let us know so we can address, inshallah. Okay, so we are almost, inshallah, nearing the end. So Sharia Supervisory Board, in this chapter, basically the composition of Sharia Supervisory Board, the stipulation, the ethics and fatwa, the process of Sharia review, and the differences between internal Sharia review and Sharia review. So those are the things that has been highlighted. We will just go through a few of things. So for example, in terms of Sharia Supervisory Board, the most important part is the composition. There has to be independent body of specialized jurists in fiqh al-mu'amalat. Jurist means faqih, the ones who have understanding of fiqh, and not only in general fiqh, particularly fiqh al-mu'amalat, the jurisdiction of financial transactions. And it should have at least 3 members and a supervisor to help it in performing its duties. By the way, out of the 3 members, there can be 1 member who is basically an expert in Islamic finance and also have some understanding of fiqh muamalat, meaning that he is not an expert in fiqh muamalat, he is not a Sharia scholar. However, he has understanding of fiqh muamalat, so he can also be part of the body. Only 1 person. The responsibilities of the Sharia Supervisory Board is basically to issue fatwa after doing the Sharia review annually, and their fatwa will basically be shared with the shareholders as well, and to provide report on opinion on what they have found. And the powers they have is that their resolutions are binding upon the Islamic financial institution, and they will have the access to view things without restrictions. So if they have to access confidential documents, that access has to be provided in order to ensure that they have proper review, so that the comment is proper. Now, the role of the SSB is so much important that they require independence. Independence is achieved through organizational status and also objectivity of the individual members. So meaning that they should have, the organizational structure should have positioned them maybe on top of the executive body, for example, on top of the CEO, on top of the COO, so that they are not influenced by the executive bodies. So that's how we need to ensure independence and also the objectivity, not to put pressure on their mind, not to force them to do something. So that's where the mental attitude of objectivity would come in, right? And why this objectivity or independence is important? Because end of the day, they need to ensure Sharia compliance. They need to ensure that public confidence is there in the Islamic financial institution, so that it translates to trust and confidence, so that they can improve the Islamic financial institution's public image. Now, if you force them, if you bar them from the independent and objectivity, then that will be barred as well, which is not good for the institution, not good for the industry as well. So that's why we need the Sharia Supervisory Board to have proper power. Now, in this slide, we have a summary of the roles and responsibilities or the differences between Sharia review and internal Sharia audit. So Sharia review is basically carried out by the Sharia Supervisory Board itself, whereby internal Sharia audit is a separate department in the financial institution. Maybe the audit department can also overlap with the Sharia audit department. When it comes to objective, the Sharia review of SSB's objective is to ensure compliance to ensure they report to the shareholders. However, for internal Sharia audit, this is basically to assist the Islamic financial institution to comply with Sharia. So there are a few other differences as well. I will not go through all of those. I hope that's the very macro view of the chapter. And again, I'm taking you to another quiz. So let's say SSB members may include, I think it's a very easy question. So SSB members may include a board member, a significant shareholder, an expert in IFI, even if he is not specialized in fiqh muamalat. Okay, thank you for your participation. I see many of you think a board member should be there. Guys and brothers and sisters, with a board member in the SSB, it completely takes out the independence of the share supervisory board. So we cannot have a board member, and a significant shareholder is the same thing. He will have influence in the Sharia decision making process. So as I also mentioned previously, it can only have an expert in IFI, even if he is not a specialist in fiqh muamalat. But again, this is also limited to one only. But overall, they should have at least 3 members. 2 out of those 3 should be experts in Islamic fiqh muamalat, jurist, faqih in fiqh muamalat. Thank you for your participation in the poll. Let's advance. Next chapter is about internal Sharia audit and review. I have only a couple of slides, I guess. Yeah. So the first slide that I have is basically a relationship. What is the relationship between the audit committee and the supervisory board? So they have basically different responsibilities. The audit committee is responsible to keep oversight of the internal Sharia audit department, whereby the internal Sharia audit department reports primarily to the audit committee. Now, audit committee, by the way, sits is part of the. You can see the audit committee is actually part of the board. Sharia supervisory board provides input when needed. It will review on the initial draft of the internal Sharia audit department's final report, and it will issue the final report to both the SSB as well as the audit committee. So that's where the difference of the responsibilities lies in. And this is basically a sampling consideration of the audit, internal Sharia audit. So they will have to look at the size of population. For example, if they want to audit Murabaha, so they need to see how many transactions they have in a branch, for example. Then what type of controls are there? What are the risks involved? How complex is the transaction? If there are issues that were raised previously as well, how frequent are the transactions? So those are some of the sampling consideration that they have to take into account when it comes to the audit. Okay, so let's go through another simple quiz. The internal Sharia audit function shall report primarily to which department? Is it to the CEO, to the SSB, or to the audit committee? Okay, thank you so much for your participation. The answer is A. I see that there are many others. I think once you go through the materials, inshallah, you'll be more familiar with those. The audit committee is the one will the Sharia internal Sharia audit function will report to. Of course, they will also share with the SSB to get their inputs, but not CEO. All right. Next chapter is about independent external Sharia audit. Uh, we can hear the Maghrib Azan in Malaysia, so we'll try to wrap up, inshallah, in very shortly. So we are almost there at the end. So the external Sharia audit, independent external Sharia audit, the responsibility they have, again, in terms of Sharia compliance, the management is the one who is responsible to ensure Sharia compliance. It's not the SSB, it's not the auditor. External Sharia auditor is basically there to express their opinion. What do they think from an external point of view? Just like for financial statements, we employ external financial auditor, right? So in order to ensure that the Sharia compliance process is transparent, right, more coherent, so we need to also bring in external Sharia auditor. If you look at for the Sharia rules and principles, what are the things that they have to look into? IOFI Sharia standards, of course, applicable laws, rulings of the Central Sharia Board of that jurisdiction, IOFI accounting standards, and the rulings of Sharia Supervisory Board of that entity. We'll quickly go through another quiz. I think after that will be just one more quiz. Yeah, so let's do that. Even after the external Sharia auditor accepts an engagement, he may discontinue if he. Can we have the poll for this, please? So even after the external Sharia auditor accepts on engagement, he may discontinue if he, number one, concludes that the work of the IFI's internal auditor is unreliable, is no longer satisfied that the engagement or audit team has appropriate competence and capabilities, and lastly, discovers that the IFI is using contracts not approved by the SSB. What do you think would be the correct answer? I know it's quite new for many of you, but it's still fine. You just answer based on your best guess and see if you were correct. All right, thank you for trying. The answer would be B. Basically, even after he is engaged, if he finds that the audit team does not have appropriate competence, then or capabilities, then he can, the external Sharia auditor may discontinue the engagement. Okay, the last chapter is about corporate social responsibility. You can see only 6% weightage is there, and it's actually very much in line with the Islamic values and principles. So inshallah, hopefully you will find it very easy. We have just one slide to recap, is that CSR in Islam is aligned with the core principles that we have. For example, vice regency, which is Khilafah. So the people on this earth are basically like representative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we are entrusted to do things in line with Allah's instructions, accountability before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment, and enjoining good and forbidding evil, al-amru bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. So in line with those three core principles, CSR should be determined in an Islamic financial institutions, right? So for the full detail, please go back to the SIPA book. We'll just end here with the very last question. The responsibility for implementation of IOFI governance standard on CSR lies with the, is it the board of directors, or is it the Sharia supervisory board, or is it the management of the IFI? What do you think? Who is responsible to basically align with this framework? Someone has put D. There is no option D on the screen actually. But yeah, thank you very much. I see most of you have got it. Is C. The management is basically responsible, and not only for CSR governance standard, but also Sharia governance standard as well. The management will be responsible for the Sharia compliance, even though we will have Sharia Supervisory Board, Internal Sharia Audit Department, and all those things. So I think it has been a long session, Alhamdulillah, but we have come to an end. Thank you so much for your participation. I would like to say some final few words, but before that, if we have any question or anything, let me go to Brother Zia. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Brother Yusuf Sultan, and thank you very much all for your participation. I know it's Maghrib time, so we only allow maybe 2 or 3 people who can ask if anybody is interested in asking any question, because in the question and answer, I don't see any question. I see only, I know that Hafiz Muhammad Shoaib has mentioned that this is a job time. Many people, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, they may be at work today, so they may not be able to listen to everything. So don't worry, we will be sharing, follow the LinkedIn, and we will be sharing the details on our LinkedIn page, inshallah, the recording and the presentation also. All the participants, we will send you the presentation, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Let me see, I see a question. Yeah, slides will be shared. I think that's all. I think there is no other question. So with this, I would like to thank once again, and those of you who are appearing in this exam, we wish you all the best, inshallah. And just want to remind you that TAIF is offering, there will be another session tomorrow for the business regulatory environment and audit and AAE, audit assurance and ethics paper. So if those of you who are attending, appearing in that exam, please make sure that you attend as well. That will also be very useful, inshallah. And as we keep reminding that we have like self-paced course done by this. This presentation is part of the self-paced course done by Mufti Yusuf Sultan and a team of other instructors. And all of you can, those of you who are not subscribed to TAIF preparatory classes may attend those classes. You need to go and register yourself at www.taiflearning.com. Or you can send an email to contact@taiflearning.com, and we will send you any information that you may require. With this, Sheikh, just few last comments from your side before we conclude, inshallah.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Just last few words is that I think I shared the same for the CSA preparation webinar as well, that always visualize the long-term goal that you have. It will start with the seeking pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, definitely as a Muslim, but then working also for the Ummah and making the change, a long-awaited change in the Islamic finance industry, and finally also stepping up in your career, right? So in line with that, please be serious if you are participating in the exam. The questions could be tricky, so please ensure that you have at least once gone through the whole SIPA book and underline the important parts, especially the definitions, the key prohibitions, the differences, etc. Right? If you haven't had proper time to prepare, please take leave from your job or whatever you are doing and prioritize that. You only have a few days left before the exam, and we wish and make dua for all of you so that you really get past the exam in the very first instance. So with that, I think I would like to finish. That's what I had to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sheikh, and thank you very much all. This brings this session to the end. So this session is concluded. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.